On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, we interview a naval officer, naval historian, naval fiction, and nonfiction writer, Berube, Claude Berube. All right, today we are joined by one of my favorite people across the planet, I have to say, is a person who invited me back in 2019 up to the Naval Academy to give a talk. And since then, I've been happy to call Claude a friend, a colleague, and it's just a great honor to get him on the show. So today we're joined by Claude Berube. He is the director of the U.S. Naval Academy Museum, but that is not how we need to know Claude. Let me be clear about this. My love for Claude goes a long way. So I put Claude up on a level of James Bond in the pantheon of things, and not just any James Bond, Claude. Let me be clear about this. I'm going back to Sean Connery style James Bond. You, sir, are a retired now Navy commander, also what Bond was. Let's be clear about that. You have done the amount of work you've done has been really impressive. You have, besides working at the U.S. Naval Academy Museum, you have been active duty reserve officer in the U.S. Navy. You've worked political not campaigns, but you worked for congressmen and senators. You have a very diversified background. You are from Maine, which I would have guessed right off the bat, by the way, having just seen you, knowing Maine. And I really wish we were having this conversation today up in Maine, outside around a campfire with some scotch or whiskey and just enjoying ourselves. To put the idea of how much I enjoy being with Claude is the type of guy I would swipe right on in a moment, and that's why I'm happy to have him on today. And we're going to talk a little bit about Claude's writings and background. Claude, was that a good enough introduction for you?
I really paid you a lot for that one. That I couldn't beat that. I was a little worried when you were talking about James Bond. It might be the Casino Royale, the one with David Niven and Woody Allen.
There's always that in the background. There's always that kind of in the background. So Claude, I brought you on here for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is your writing is, to me, amazing because you do a little bit of everything. You do fiction and nonfiction. And obviously, one of the big reasons I wanted to get you on is you've got the third volume in the Connor Stark series coming out, which we're going to talk about. But at the same time, you're a person who writes some of the best nonfiction naval books around. I had an opportunity to review last year on Wide Seas. You delved into a naval topic that few have dealt into, which is the Jacksonian era of the U.S. Navy. And what I want to do before I jump into any of this is I am always interested in kind of the Brian Lamb C-SPAN question is, where do you do your writing? How do you go about picking a topic and then writing about a topic?
I start with something I don't know or that I want to know more about, and I explore it from there. In the case of On Wide Seas, it was by accident. I had written my first naval history book. It was a biography of Commodore Charles Stewart, the USS Constitution during the War of 1812. I'd written that, came out in 2005. When I started my doctoral dissertation, which became On Wide Seas, I was working on another topic entirely. It was about Anglo-American naval relations, 1939 to 1941. I was going to focus on Alan Goodrich Kirk, who was the naval attaché to Ambassador Joseph Kennedy. I was working on that for about a year or so, really enjoying the topic. I knew there were about 50 boxes of archived material, mostly Kirk's letters, at Naval History and Heritage Command. And I said, okay, well, I'll hold off. I'll just do the secondary research. I finally went about a year or two later and asked the archivist, I said, I'd like to see Kirk's papers. And she said, no, we can't show those to you. I was like, excuse me? And she said, Kyle Lott, and explained to me that there was an amendment by Senators John Kyle and Trent Lott, which restricted access to a lot of archive materials that dealt with the development of atomic weapons after, and this bill came out, I think, after 9/11. It was a result of the attacks on 9/11. And I explained to her, I said, well, I'm just really interested in 39 to 41, maybe the war years, but Kirk was like on the Atomic Energy Commission, like in the 50s, has nothing to do. She goes, doesn't matter. The entire thing has been classified. I said, well, how would I get access to this? Because historian trying to get something done. And she said, well, it would take somebody with, we don't have the staff. I said, okay. and we don't have anybody on staff who has the top secret clearance to be able to review this to determine if these papers are classified or not. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm a Navy reservist. I have my TSSCI. I'm an intelligence officer. I'd be happy, no cost orders, to come in and take care of this for you if I can have access to them for my papers, for my work. And she just looked up at me and said, no, we're not going to do that. I was like, okay. So then I had to find another topic for my doctoral dissertation and came across an item from my first book. And I was really interested in this ship of the line, the largest ship of the line we ever built, the USS Pennsylvania. I'd written an article about it. And then I decided to look into the 1830s. Again, it's one of these periods that people don't really look at, but the Navy's been doing things for 200 years. You know that, Sal. And so I just really tried to tell the story of the Navy during Jackson's presidency from an operational standpoint, personnel, strategy, threats. Geez, what else was in there? The ship, the platforms themselves. And I was lucky to have some incredible mentors, including Wick Murray, Williamson Murray, who's written a lot of books. So that's how I wrote that book. And but if you're talking both fiction and nonfiction, it really goes back to when I was in grad school. I had an incredible mentor, Laverne Kuhnke, one of my professors who's since passed. And I said, Professor, I have a problem. I want to write both fiction and nonfiction. Which one do I do? Thinking she would just say, you need to stick with history. And to her credit, she said, why not do both? There's a professor at Columbia who's a friend of mine. He wrote this novel called The Sufi Fiddle, but he's also an expert on the Middle East. Why don't you do both? And that's what I did. It just took me a long time to get there. So that's how I look at writing topics.
Well, and I think it actually spills over in each case, because I know in the kind of Stark books you get history in there. I mean, Stark's name obviously is a very historical name, and same thing on the history side, because I mean you weave a good story. I mean the narrative comes through in it, and so I think on both cases it definitely plays out. And then I mean obviously we were joking about it before. I can't help but notice that you wanted to investigate Captain Kirk. Was your first topic is the science fiction side, where you hosted just prior to COVID and throughout COVID NavyCon, where you brought together science fiction authors and developers to kind of talk about the science fiction application of naval topics. And I think all around that's what really entices a lot of people toward you is this element. But let's talk about the latest novel out. And I don't want to give any spoilers away about the book because I want everyone to enjoy it when they read it. But this is actually it's the third volume of the series. I know you wrote an earlier volume that wasn't published. So how would you, what's the elevator speech you would give for the Connor Stark series?
The series is about a former naval officer turned mercenary, if you will, who heads up a private Navy company in small gray wars around the world that always have China in the background, where they're always trying to exert their influence. And he's looking at one option and usually discovers that, yes, China's behind it yet again. So it's all about China's growth in the world and their influence. It's about the seas, something that you and John Conrad over at G Captain write about. I like to write about the oceans writ large, not just about the navies, but the pirate ships, the merchant ships, private security ships that we have seen in the past, to let people know, wider audience, about some of the topics I do write about in my nonfiction work.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big appeals I had, because I remember reading the first novel, Aiden. I forget the exact title. I apologize.
Aiden Effect, yeah.
Aiden Effect, and I was like, wow, this is really bringing a lot of things that I love together. I mean, you were getting everything in the world there, and you tend to follow along in these key areas. The first volume was at Aden, the second one was off Sri Lanka. Now the third volume is South China Sea, Southern Philippines, and these are all maritime hotspots around the world. So, are you influenced by real world events, or are you kind of looking into the future a little bit where you're seeing these events? Because I know in the recent volume you were tapping into an island, an area that was just in the news with a fairly large military exercise.
Well, a broken clock is right twice a day, and I think that's what happens with my writing. Certainly the first novel deals with the Gulf of Aden, and I'd operated there, so it was a little easier to think about that in terms of both nonfiction and fiction. And the second one, Sri Lanka, at that time I was teaching a course on maritime security challenges, and one of the modules was about maritime terrorists. So we delved into the Tamil sea tigers, and I thought, well, what happens if they come back? And then this novel, Balabac Island. It's the southernmost Philippine island, very remote. I didn't know that much about it before. I did a lot of research on it just to understand, maybe the language, the local terrain, the animals even, and and literally the book came out the 30th of April, and about a week after, I think it was announced that we'd been doing military exercises in 4 Philippine islands, including Balabac Island, a place that I'd never heard of before. And so when I write these novels, I don't start off with, hey, I'm going to write about the Philippines and this island, or I'm going to write about Yemen. It really is, I wanted to look at the region first, and it usually has to have some criteria. It has to have a lot of merchant ships around, because there are merchant ships all around the world doing work every day, as you know. And I want people to understand as they're reading the novels that, again, that there are more things than just navies that are covered by the media. There are the merchant ships that are rarely covered unless there's an attack. There's the illegal aspect, the illicit trafficking, all of these aspects of what is happening on the high seas. And I think Ian Urbina does a fantastic job too. He wrote The Outlaw Ocean, and then he wrote the series for the New York Times prior to that, about all these aspects of the ocean. So I start with the region. I think about, okay, what is the main theme of this? Is it going to be terrorism? Is it going to be piracy? Is it going to be, what happens in this book, the Philippine Pact? And then I look at the nations right around that region to figure out what plays best in the storyline. And it was kind of funny in the case of Yemen, the Aden effect. I had operated off of Somalia in early 2005 on a Navy cruiser, and I was supposed to go back in 2009 on a Blackwater ship, and then I was going to be on a Maersk ship in order to bring me back, because I wanted to write a book about the whole aspect, about Somali piracy and merchant ships and all the effects on various communities. And I ended up meeting the defense attaché for Yemen by accident. The editor at the Washington Times at the time had hired me as a special correspondent. I was going to take a leave. I took a leave of absence for a while from the academy. I was an adjunct then. And a night or so before I was supposed to leave, one of the things that happened, Rich brought over this guy in a Mercedes Benz, and we talked and smoked cigars for a good chunk of the night, drank scotch. And it turned out he was not only defense attaché, but he was the nephew of the president. And he said, well, you will come to, when you are out there, you'll come to Yemen, and we'll show you around. And of course, the trip never happened because Blackwater never got a client. And so my publisher at that point said, or my editor, Rich, said, hey, just don't have a story. So that's one of those things that I probably should have gone anyway, just for the adventure, and didn't. But that's how I really look at some of these countries in the books.
This is, by the way, Claude, where I get the James Bond element right here. This conversation where you're having cigars with the defense attaché from Yemen. This is the type of thing that I enjoy listening to your stories about. The series is really an amazing one because you jump through time. You jump through, obviously, you have some key characters. You have some secondary characters that follow along here. But again, you're touchstoning on key topics that I think are relevant because you, again, not just are a director of the Naval Academy Museum, but you're also a professor at the Naval Academy. So you're teaching students, midshipmen who are becoming officers, not just in the U.S. Navy, by the way. I know you have international students there too. How does what your research, both in the fiction, nonfiction, play out in the classroom there at the U.S. Naval Academy?
So I teach naval history. When I taught in the political science department, however, for the first 7 years I was here, I taught intelligence and national security as well. I taught American government. I taught a course on maritime security challenges of the 21st century. And those were extremely helpful in helping me develop some of the ideas that I had about the oceans. But even in my naval history class, I try to bring in what's going on every day. In fact, especially for my international students, every week or so, I'll start off class with a 5-minute presentation based on my just doing a search. What's happened in the navies or the coast guards or off the waters of each of these countries, whether it's Malaysia, Philippines, South Korea, Romania, and you can always find stories. So I try to bring those in to relate our naval history writ large and some of the issues you need to think about in terms of today's operations. And it's more relatable for, especially for the international mids, because they're in a foreign country studying for 4 years. And also as a partnership, it shows that we're working both ways. We're not just teaching them about US naval history. We're incorporating their expertise. And that's what I think is really important. You know, Sal, you're a professor too, and you'll understand this. The first slide I show every semester, I've been doing it for years, are my teaching principles. The first thing is what I know and you don't know, I'm going to teach you, because I'm really old. I've read a lot more books and I've just been around longer, but it doesn't mean I'm smarter than you. And I know I'm not smarter. The second principle is what you know and I don't know, you're going to teach me, because every one of you is from a different part of the country, different economic background, different skill sets, different parts of the world. And I don't know about those things. So bringing in those things in terms of the class is important. And then the third principle is what neither of us knows, we're going to learn together. I think it's been an incredibly valuable learning tool for me and a teaching tool. So that's what I really try to do in the class with regard to the topics that I address, not only in the novels, but in my nonfiction.
And the other element I want you to bring into it, because I think you are a master doing it. I like to think I'm pretty good at it, but I don't hold a candle to you. And that's the experiential learning. I mean, your office right now, you're sitting in your office. I've been in your office in the Naval Academy. You walk out the door of your office, you're in the museum, and you have, I mean, just if anyone has never been to the Naval Academy Museum, they need to go. It is a treasure trove of a site to go see. Get in there. It is one of my favorite places. Every 2 years I go up for the McMullen Naval History Symposium. One of my favorites is the reception in the museum, because of the great history and crab cakes. I'm not going to lie, the crab cakes are great, but it's absolutely fantastic. And you do 2 examples. I mean, this year I took my maritime history class down to the battleship North Carolina for an experiential learning. You've done 2 that I absolutely love, and I want you to talk about either about both or one. Sure. And that is the galley fight, and then taking the midshipmen out on the links on Chesapeake Bay. Feel free to talk about either one of them, because I think that it's such a great experience for the midshipmen.
Sure. Well, when I was mobilized to Gitmo 5 years ago, and I have to qualify, I was at Gitmo, I was not in Gitmo. I was deputy J2 of the JTF down there, and I had seen this short video on YouTube about these elementary school kids at a summer camp, and they were being taught how to march like Roman legions. You know, it was like first line, advance, shields up, and they learned in a very quick time. I said, wouldn't it be great if we could do that on the water? And then I just started thinking about it. I said, wait a minute, we could. So I reached out to the ancient historian here on staff. She's since left, unfortunately, Kelsey Sagstetter. And I said, Kelsey, I got a crazy idea. You teach Roman Carthaginian battles, right? She goes, yeah. I said, I have an idea. Let's work on something. So we worked with the seamanship and navigation folks. We worked with the phys ed department, because they had all these kayaks, different colors. So we said, okay, we'll use red for Carthaginian, blue for Roman. And we recreated the Battle of Drepanum during the Roman Carthaginian wars. And so you see, in fact, if you go to Battle of Drepanum, excuse me, on YouTube, we had a drone up to film this. And
I'll link it into the video here, so you'll be good.
Okay, so you see them come up and they engage in the battle, and Vice Admiral Buck, the superintendent, gave them his perspective on the tactics used, and it was just a great event. The second one, or was actually the first, I'd wanted to do for years, and I thought, well, look, West Point has an incredible advantage in teaching, because they can take cadets to Gettysburg and they can understand the contour. They can see where Joshua Chamberlain was at Little Round Top. Sal, you and I can take our students to Philippine Sea and say, hey, mids, here's water. And that's about it. So I said, wait a minute. The Chesapeake Bay was one of the 3 major maritime operations, operational areas during the War of 1812. Let's figure something out. So the first year I chartered 2 tall ships, the Pride of Baltimore II and the Lynx. They're both replica privateers from the War of 1812. Took 12 midshipmen aboard, and I also had professor of chemistry to talk about the chemistry behind gunpowder, an economics professor to talk about trade between the colonies, or later the country and Britain, etc. So it was a way for this multidisciplinary experiential learning where the midshipmen are actually, climbing the rigging. They're doing CNAV. They're sitting in the bow of the ship, listening to a schoolmaster as they would have done 200 years ago. You've got the 2 ships circling each other, firing their guns. And with all of this, it really just came together. We did it for last year was the last year we did it. And then what we do is we pull into now historic London town, and we work with the Historic Marine Company. And they have 3 modules. The one of the small arms, so they show them how to use pikes and a few other boarding axes. The second one is where they teach them how to fire the muskets in unison. And then the third is where they fire a 12-pound artillery piece. And again, you can see this if you type in Schoolhouse at Sea, War of 1812 Schoolhouse at Sea on YouTube. And you see what the midshipmen are going through on this, and they really get a different perspective. So that's why I'm a huge fan of multidisciplinary experiential learning. It's not just about the books. It's not just about the videos. And again, Sal, you and I we learned in a different environment. You and I were in high school, elementary school without computers. I think you're a few years younger than I am, so you may have had them. But I was still using a quill and papyrus, and non-electric typewriters.
I mean, that learning experience is, I remember when you did it, it was so great to watch and to see. And that's one of the unique aspects that I think you bring into the writing. Let's talk about the latest novel a little bit, and what got you writing about it, to come back in, because it's been a bit of a gap between the second and the third volume. So what was it that kind of really fired you up to, return back to the series?
Am I able to use curse words on here, Sal?
It's going on YouTube, so it's
okay,
on
great.
YouTube. So
I'll be very careful. I'll be very diplomatic. After my second novel came out, I was well into my doctoral dissertation, and Professor John Gooch from the University of Leeds, wonderful gentleman, great scholar. I love John. But he just looked at me, and he was not happy with the progress of my dissertation. He said, "Claude, you will stop writing the goddamn novels and get back to your dissertation." And so once I finished the dissertation, I turned the dissertation into a book. And that's when I said, I really need to tell some more stories. And that's when I turned back, and I had some time off. I was away. I'd gone back to Capitol Hill for a third tour, left, and then I had time. So I just traveled and stayed at a friend's lakeside cottage up in upstate New York. I stayed at former students who had now a orchard in New Jersey. And I stayed at their farmhouse and just wrote wherever I could. And that's where the Philippine Pact was designed. But really, it's a story that goes back 30 or more years. I was thinking about this book in the late early 1990s, I guess, and I did write the first in the series that was never published. And I'm thinking of rewriting that and turning it into a sequel, where Connor Stark is dealing with an issue in Canada, and that's what sets him. He's still an officer at that point, but that's what sets him down the road to the court-martial that leads to him being drummed out of the Navy and helping to found this private security company at sea. But really, when I was designing the book, I wanted to take issues, but they have to be people-driven. And I said, okay, who are the characters going to be? And you referred to Stark before, and I've told the story before that people think, oh, well, you're just thinking about the Marvel comics and Tony Stark. I said, no. In 1987, I was writing my senior thesis in college, and it was on General John Stark. I went to college in New Hampshire, and he was a Revolutionary War guy. And when I was starting to write the first novel that was unpublished, I needed a name. I said, he's going to be the descendant of this General John Stark. It's going to make things easy. And so I did that. But also at this time, if you remember, there was a television show at that time called Spencer for Hire. It was starred Robert Urich, and he's a detective in Boston, but it was based on a book series by Robert B. Parker, who's one of my favorite authors. And it was this triad. You had Robert Urich, the private eye. You had Hawk, played by Avery Brooke. And again, I have to bring in Star Trek because Avery Brooke was
Benjamin
Captain
Sisko.
There we go. You know, who's the hitman, kind of works for the mafia sometime. And then you've got Susan, who is Spencer's girlfriend, the psychologist. And I said, I want to create three characters that you're going to see in these novels. So Stark becomes the guy who's operating outside the bounds of the law. Sometimes he tries to stay within the law. You've got Damian Golzari, the diplomatic security agent, who's a career law enforcement guy. You know, he's the guy in Les Mis. You know, I am the law, and the law is not mocked. And then you've got Ambassador C.J. Sumner, who's the soft-powered diplomat, very sharp. And how do these three people deal with the same situation in each book? Now, I didn't have Sumner in as much. She just comes in toward the end of Siren Song, and but I've got Golzari, and Sumner is now the national security advisor to the president, and Golzari is now in the Philippine Pact, investigating a human trafficking group in Paris, and Connor Stark is working with the Philippine Navy, doing a training exercise on Balabac Island. So that's how really the story developed over the course of my career.
Again, I read your novels and I love them because to me they have a semblance of a realism that was missing from some novels I remember reading at the time. I can always remember picking up, you know, a Tom Clancy novel and reading it and being awed by the amount of detail, and also by the awe about how everything works perfectly. And everything doesn't quite always work perfectly in yours, which I always like too. There's a lot of realism in it. I also like, you know, you bring in Stark being outside the norms of the Navy. And I want to talk about a topic that you have talked about, and I've read your stuff on this, and I actually used something that you wrote about this. And this is agencies that operate on the seas outside the bounds. And so, you know, we talk about groups like Greenpeace at sea. We talk about the Sea Shepherds, and you've written extensively about these and whether or not, you know, these non-nation state player actors on the ocean play a role. So I'm interested in your perspective on that. What's your view on those organizations outside of navies and nationalities?
So there's two types of organizations. They're the private security companies at sea. Sorry about that. There are private security companies at sea, which I can't think of one that actually has a lot of ships right now, but there are some still out there. During the height of piracy, you had a number of companies that either had ships or were claiming to have ships. Those were directly hired by companies to protect ships going through the Gulf of Aden. And to date, no ship going attacked by pirates, especially in that region, that has had armed guards, has been captured or successfully attacked.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I love your story you tell about being in that meeting where the issue came up about putting armed security on board private vessels.
Yeah, I was at a maritime security conference, and it was right after my article on Black Waters for the Blue Waters came out in Orbis, and so that was 06 or 07. And I'm giving the address on hey, the theme was, if piracy continues to emerge, and as private security companies come out of Iraq and Afghanistan, what we're going to probably see is this influx of armed guards at sea. We're probably going to see ships companies having ships as a result to protect shipping companies. And this guy at the back of the room with one of the major shipping companies stood up and said, in the middle of my talk, says, "You don't know what you're talking about. We'll never do that." And less than a year later, his company has armed guards aboard, and you know they had 3 teams to have coverage. So yeah, it just happens. In fact, I told him, I said, "Look, I hope it doesn't happen, but this is my thinking based on what I'm seeing among these trends." So there's that group. Then there are the non-governmental organizations, you know, the Greenpeace, the Sea Shepherd. I've really investigated Sea Shepherd a lot. In fact, I did a pretty major case study for Naval War College a few years ago now, on the evolution of this organization, an organization that started off in the 1970s and 1980s simply by chasing Japanese whalers, and we saw this on Animal Planet's television show about them. That was maybe 2011 to 2016 or so. But now they have a fleet of ships. They've got about a dozen ships. They operate around the world. But they don't chase these Japanese whalers anymore. What they've done is what I had hoped the private security companies could do when I was writing Blackwater, so Blue Waters. Basically, you work with the government, you operate under their aegis, you are regulated, your efforts are coordinated with the government, and there's accountability. And that's what actually Sea Shepherd has done. They have operated with the Mexican government, Gabon, Benin, a number of other countries in Africa, which are really suffering in their economy from these illegal fishing trawlers, by and large from China too. So you will see this in a future novel. But I've interviewed a lot of their leadership, interviewed the founder, Paul Watson. Peter Hammerstadt was up here to give a talk to midshipmen. And it's really interesting to see the evolution. And basically what Sea Shepherd does is they provide the ship, they provide the crew, they provide the fuel. There's a different flag that goes up. They have a law enforcement detachment that comes aboard their ship. And for these countries which can't afford to have larger platforms that say go, 10, 20 miles off their coast, can't operate for long periods of time, here you've got Sea Shepherd providing that. And then all you have to do is provide 5, 10, 12 person law enforcement detachments, naval detachments, Coast Guard detachments, etc., whatever that particular country has. And it's a fantastic operation. I think Sea Shepherd has now interdicted and helped investigate something like 80 of those ships. They do boardings, they do training with the individuals. It's really an incredible evolution of an organization, and I think has been extremely helpful. I wish we could expand that to deal with IUU fishing, illegal unreported, unregulated fishing. And yeah, I think you and I know presence is important. We can't always be everywhere at the same time, and to have NGOs that are acting in a responsible manner with the host country is a fantastic force multiplier. And that's why in my novels, I try to show, hey, here's a private security company that's trying to do that, that's trying to work with host countries. It doesn't always do it, but.
First off, I know you're working on a new project, and so I have to ask this question. Are you going to make me read another book about Hyman Rickover, and are you going to make me think that he isn't the biggest tool in the world to everyone? Because I've heard all the stories about Rickover and the interviews and the wobbly chairs and just being all who Hyman J. Rickover is.
No, you're not going to. Here's why. I'm not going to tell that story. I'm letting Hyman Rickover tell that story because his late wife, his second wife, Eleanor, I got to know her before she passed, and the co-executors of her estate agreed that all of his personal papers should come to the Naval Academy Museum, and I got them over to another facility to process, and I've transcribed a lot. There are more than 250, I think now, archival boxes full of his papers going back to 1929. This goes to the 1930s when he's writing daily love letters to his then first wife. And you see a perspective on Rickover. It's you just like, this is Rickover. And it goes right through. He has a lot of memoranda of understanding. Memoranda for the record, where he has a meeting with a CNO or another admiral, and he'll write up what just happened. He has transcripts from telephone conversations in the 70s and 80s with presidents, major journalists, sec navs, sec defs. The primary source material is amazing. Now, I will say there's only one historian that's ever seen these before, and that was Francis Duncan, who was hired by Rickover, spent a lot of time with Rickover to write the official biography. I am not going to recreate an official biography. I'm not recreating a biography, but I do know, having read Duncan's book and the others, that the material was very selective, and Rickover was told him in his contract, wrote in the contract, you will have access to the papers. You will not use anything I do not permit. So that's why you see snippets of these things in Duncan's book. But what I'm going to do is let Rickover tell it in his own words. The tentative title is Rickover Uncensored, and that's how my agent is pitching it to the publishers. And I'll do an introduction, and then I've selected what I think is indicative of Rickover's life in his own words.
Finally, Claude, last little thing I want to ask you is this my audience is an audience that looks at kind of global shipping, looks at how the world is connected through trade and commerce. You're at the U.S. Naval Academy. You're teaching the future, captains and admirals that are going to go out there. With it, what is the issue right now that you see coming forward that we should be paying a lot more attention to? Is it China? Is it something that we're not even thinking about yet at this point? Because again, you tend to look at things in a very unique way through nonfiction and fiction.
Right. I think no question it's China, and all of the ramifications. And again, Sal, you've talked about this before. It's everything. It's it's part of what I teach in naval history, especially the first few weeks where I talk about why a nation rises in terms of a naval power and why it declines. And generally, what was it, Raleigh or Drake, who said the Navy follows the trade. Well, you don't build a Navy unless you have a large merchant fleet to protect. That's the first phase. Historically, it doesn't always happen. But when you look at where our merchant ships are, it's anemic in terms of both shipbuilding and our folks at sea. Where's China? Their ships number in the thousands. Ours number in a few score. It is their economic power. It is the fact that they have become the #1 Navy, and we're going to have to deal with that. We have now an aging Navy. I've run the numbers, and something like 80% of their surface combatants have been commissioned in the past decade. Only 20% of ours have. There is an age difference. Yes, we have experience, but they are gaining experience very quickly. I think we underestimated them for too long. I will share this one story from a particular Navy organization I was associated with many years ago, probably 20 years ago. And I asked the China expert there, I said, hey, you worried about China? He said, why? Yeah, they got a couple of Sovremenies. If we ever get into a war with them, we'll just dust off the old Cold War book that we had with the Soviets and we'll be fine. And again, kind of like that guy, telling me at the back of the room, I think it was a bit of hubris. He wasn't saying it in he was semi-light-hearted way. But I think we underestimated the ability of China to build a large merchant fleet and a large Navy in a very quick time. I think we continue to do so in many ways. And I don't know how we are truly addressing that because and again, the latest article that I'm actually working on, Sal, I'll be I'm pretty open with what I'm working on. It's called tentatively, is the United States still a maritime power? And I put that question out on Twitter kind of as a fun survey a couple of days ago. But when you look at all the criteria that makes a nation a maritime power, vice a naval power, we are certainly a naval power. But I'm arguing we are no longer a maritime power. And we need to be a maritime power in conjunction and in order to continue to be a naval power. Because when your average American forgets, we have not only sea blindness, but we have this blindness as a nation on what it really means to be on the ocean and to support a Navy and to have a Navy.
I Couldn't agree with you more, Claude. And one of the things I really want to leave the viewers with is of course, I'll have the list for all of Claude's books available here for you to do. But Claude is a must follow on Twitter. I love following Claude on Twitter. It's always great material. I love when you post those charts and the data you get into. I know we were just talking the other day about the 44th Squadron of the Chinese Navy that's heading over to East Africa. They're learning, and Chinese ships built 20 years ago. We used to laugh about them in the Merchant Marine that they're going to fall apart. Ones building today are not something we laugh about anymore. And I get concerned about the hubris people have regarding the Chinese Navy and the Chinese military, saying they don't have experience. They haven't really fought a world war in so many X years. And I just, I'm doing a lot of research right now in World War II, and I keep reading the same thing about the Japanese Navy, and I keep reading that, that they don't have much experience. We'll be able to beat them. There'll not be an issue. And then lo and behold, their tactics, their strategy, their technology was something that we just were not ready to deal with.
Yeah, and sorry about that, Sal. The one I use is 1898, and Segismundo Bermeo, who was the Minister of Marine of the Spanish Navy, basically underestimating the United States. Who are the Americans? What world war have they fought? We're the Spanish Empire, and we all know how that turned out.
Claude, I want to thank you for your time and being on the show today. I want to recommend, again, Claude's books, both on the fiction, nonfiction side. We'll have links to them in the show notes. If you get an opportunity, I cannot strongly recommend it enough to stop by the U.S. Naval Academy Museum, spend some time there, go through the exhibits. What Claude has out there is only a fraction of what he has behind the scenes. It's an amazing museum to spend the day. There's nothing better than spending a day on the yard, the Naval Academy. And so I really recommend it. Claude, thank you so much for spending a day with us and being with us.
Always good to talk to you, Sal.